Is that better? Yes? Okay. I think Anna said yes. Okay. Great. All right. Now we can get started with the next session and the introduction of our first speaker, Daniil Zavlunov, who is a musicologist whose research spans several broad areas, including opera in 19th century Russia and the history of music theory. He has recent publications focused on opera censorship in the 19th century and the politics of music theory in the Soviet Union. His work has appeared in the Journal of Musicology, Cambridge Opera Journal, Proceedings of the British Academy, Russian Literature, Music Theory Online, and the Journal of Music Theory, along with other publications. He's currently writing a cultural history of opera in Russia during the reign of Nicholas I, which draws heavily on new archival sources. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Zavlunov, who is presenting on opera audiences in 1830s St. Petersburg.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Excellent. Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. There's no denying it that over the past 3 decades, scholars have made significant strides in deepening our collective understanding of opera in Russia during the first half of the 19th century. Research has explored Russian operatic works through hermeneutic lenses, examined the cultural policies shaping Russia's operatic landscape, uncovered important archival documents about domestic and foreign opera troops and composers active in Russia, clarified the role of institutions like censorship in making opera possible, and analyzed contributions of key players from the Tsar all the way down to music copyists. Still, this emergent, holistic picture of Russia's operatic system and culture is missing one important component, namely any real understanding of opera audiences, especially for the period of the 1830s. Who were these consumers of opera, and what numbers did they attend the theater? What were their ethnic and linguistic backgrounds and their social and professional composition? How did these factors influence their repertorial preferences and their patronage of specific troupes? How much did they pay for an opera ticket, and what did that cost mean within their monthly budgets? How did these audiences interact with one another, navigate shared theater spaces, and adhere to various codes of theater etiquette? And more generally, what significance did opera hold for these listeners? I will not pretend that I can answer these questions in 20 minutes, but I would like to suggest some answers to a few of them by investigating opera audiences in the 1830s St. Petersburg. My talk today is not about audience reception of specific composers, opera singers, or productions. Rather, I'm interested in the audiences themselves and in the broader trends in audience engagement with opera as a genre. To tell my story, I draw on a wide range of sources, including contemporaneous opera criticism, epistolary evidence, memoirs, and government documents. To understand opera audiences, we have to have some basic sense of the troupes that sang opera, of their repertoire, of the physical spaces in which opera could be heard, and of the cost of hearing it. Let me provide some of this information specifically for the year 1830. No one European capital has so many multilingual theaters as we have here in St. Petersburg. We have Russian, ballet, French, German, and Italian troupes, which daily offer various entertainments to all classes of the society, wrote the Theater Almanac that year. All these troupes were part of the imperial theater system, and all were state-owned, but not all were operatic. By 1830, the French troupe no longer performed opera, and it would not for the rest of Nikolai's reign. Opera in French was not accessible to St. Petersburg audiences. The French troupe specialized in vaudeville and primarily catered to the Russian nobility and the city's French-speaking residents. By contrast, the Italian troupe was exclusively operatic. It has been performing in the city since January of 1828, and in 1830 was entering what would prove to be its final year. During its 3-year residence, the troupe flooded St. Petersburg with the music of Rossini. Almost all of Rossini's Italian operas were performed, most of them for the very first time in St. Petersburg. The troupe also introduced the city to the music of Mercadante and Pacini, as it did to the practice of staging full-length serious operas that were sung throughout, a novelty in the city. The Italian project was conceived as opera of the aristocracy, but the reality proved different, as I will explain momentarily. The state also considered it essential to maintain a permanent German theater troupe in the city in which 10% of the population, some 40,000 residents, were German speakers. In 1830, the German troupe was predominantly an operatic one, though it also staged spoken drama. At the time, most of its repertoire was Germanic, including Mozart's Zauberflöte, Beethoven's Fidelio, Weigel's Die Schweizer Familie, Weber's Freischütz, and Marschner's Vampir. It also had two of Rossini's comic operas in its repertoire in German translation. The Russian troupe specialized in spoken drama, but it did perform light operas, even though it did not have professional singers at this time. Russian operatic theater was still solidly grounded in the turn of the century Italian aesthetic of Paisiello, Cimarosa, and Paer, and of course of the Russian and Russified Italian composers like Cabos, as well as the aesthetic of early 19th century French opéra comique. Rossini's operas were familiar in translation, though they were performed rarely and never as written. The vast majority of the theatrical spectacles by the Russian troupe consisted of 2 or 3 works, often mixing genres. In one evening and in the same theater, one could partake in spoken comedy, opera, and ballet. Russian theatergoers liked their variety. All opera audiences expected to understand the language in which the opera was sung. Because of this, there was very little crossing of audiences. Russian speakers went to the Russian opera, German speakers to the German, Russian aristocracy went to French vaudeville. Among the many reasons for the failure of the Italian opera company was the fact that the Italian language was still unfamiliar to most. Opera could be heard at various venues. However, St. Petersburg's main operatic stage, and from 1836 its only operatic stage, was the Bolshoi Kamenny Theater. The stage was shared on alternating nights by all operatic troupes, each of which typically played 2 shows per week. The Bolshoi was one of Europe's largest and most comfortable opera theaters. In 1830, it had the seating capacity of about 1,500, and this was increased to 1,800 during the major reconstruction of 1836, which, in addition to supplying more seats, also raised the ceiling and expanded the stage. Wrote one observer after the renovations, and I quote, "The whole is magnificently decorated, extremely spacious, and comfortable." After 1836, the theater consisted of the parterre, with its 17 rows of armchairs and regular chairs, for the total of about 450 seats. The rest of the theater was tiered with 142 boxes spread across the 5 tiers. There was also the Imperial Loge and 10 super loges for the royal family and various ministers. The rest of the space, the balcony, the gallery, and the 6th tier, plus the amphitheater, consisted of bench seating accommodating around 400 audience members. In 1830, the ticket prices for the 3 troupes differed slightly. The price for the Italian and Russian troupes were comparable. Those for the German opera were lower, suggesting that its audience would have been socially different. The ticket prices that you see on the slide remained stable throughout the entire decade. So what do these prices mean in terms of the buying power of the ruble? One can illustrate the value only relationally by providing some basic prices of goods and average monthly salaries. So what could one buy for a ruble, which was the cost of the cheapest ticket in the house? One could buy 100 kilograms of potatoes, or 16 kilos of wheat flour, or 40 eggs, or several kilograms of protein, and some various life's essentials like candle and soap, and maybe even a pair of boots. 1 ruble was a lot of money, but its real value only becomes obvious when one considers some average monthly earnings. Here's a sample for what one might call the middle class earners. A hospital nurse earned 10 rubles a month, a factory worker anywhere from 10 to 25, school teachers and college professors between 50 and 100 rubles, and various civil servants earned from 30 rubles a month to about 150. If you made 150 rubles a month, you were very well off. Could these earners attend opera in light of these prices? Sure, but they could not do it often, and they would have to be confined to very specific spaces within the theater, basically the uppermost tier. Theater space then must have been highly stratified, with the parterre seats and most of the loges affordable only to the city's most affluent residents. And it would be logical to conclude that St. Petersburg's top earners and nobility were the chief patrons of opera. That conclusion would be wrong. For the first half of the 1830s, evidence is overwhelming that the city's social elites did not frequent opera on a regular basis, no matter what opera troupe, theater, or language. They certainly did not attend Russian opera. Looking over the theater year 1830, the almanac noted, "Unfortunately, our high society is almost entirely alien to the Russian troupe. Having been abandoned by high society, Russian theater holds on only by way of its own dignity and the revitalizing care of the well-meaning authorities." A young noblewoman from the provinces visiting St. Petersburg in the same year wrote back home to a friend, "People of high society usually attend French shows and only the first performances of Italian opera, but to the Russian theater they send their children with their nannies to watch the devils and the flying spirits. As for the German theater, there is not a peep in high society. It is as if it does not exist." So the German troops received even less attention from the social elites. The aristocratic attendance at the Italian troops' performances was also small on a good day, and much of the time it was catastrophically low. Reporting on the Italian troupe in 1830, the theater almanac mused, "When it was not here yet, all the dilettanti, real and imagined, cried, 'What delight, what bliss it would be if only we could have Italian opera.' By now, everyone is tired of this pleasure, and the theater is almost always half empty." According to Raphael Zotov, who was intimately involved in the affairs of the theater's directorate in the 1830s, public interest in Italian opera lasted exactly 1 year. The following year, the subscription weakened. During the third year, it collapsed entirely, and the passion for the Italians cooled off. But that passion, aristocratic or otherwise, for Italian opera was not there to begin with. The novelty of Italian opera wore off very early. Reviewing the sixth performance of the troupe's first season, the Severnaya Pchela wrote, "Was it so long ago that one could not get a seat at the Italian theater? Now there are barely a few loges taken in the first tier. In the second and in the third tiers, every loge is empty, and for the armchairs, only 6 rows were occupied." By 1830, the theater was rarely more than 1/4 full. The lack of attendance at opera on the part of the aristocracy was no indication of their disinterest in the genre. There is ample evidence that many aristocrats were indeed connoisseurs of Italian opera. Attending opera, however, simply did not carry any cultural or social prestige. Put another way, going to opera was not something that one did in the early 1830s St. Petersburg, no matter one's social class. And that is why the Russian and German theaters remained just as empty as the Italian. In the city with a population of over 400,000 residents, the nightly opera theater occupancy averaged 500 audience members. Still, among these, each troupe had its dedicated patrons. The majority of the audience members who attended the performances of the Russian opera troupe consisted of the litterateurs, journalists, office functionaries relaxing from their labors, well-off merchants, and the enlightened petty bourgeoisie. This, at least, according to the Theater Almanac, which also admitted with sadness that even these people rarely fill up the theater. The same almanac explained that the Russian opera is in a state of near collapse because of low attendance, which it attributed to poor singing and dated repertoire. The situation with German theater was no better. Writing in his diary, a British naval officer commented, "At the German theater tonight, the acting was below mediocrity, the house empty." In the same year, the correspondent for the British Harmonicon reported regarding the German troupe, The decorations are beautiful and the costumes rich, but the orchestra is bad and incomplete, and vainly would you look for a distinguished singer in the company. Hence, the theater is generally deserted. Like the Russian troupe, the German one had its aficionados, the German-speaking mid-level civilians and military officials, scholars, artists, merchants, and artisans. But their numbers were minuscule, and on any given night, the opera theater was empty. The government was fully aware of the flailing operatic culture in the city, and it took deliberate steps to socially engineer what one might call an opera surge, the surge that would help generate social prestige for opera, cultivate public taste for it, and with that increase opera audiences. The process began in 1830 and fully manifested itself by 1835. After dissolving the Italian opera troupe in 1831, the state embarked on the path of revamping the German opera by transferring the fine Italian opera orchestra to German opera and hiring some of Europe's best German singers, like the sopranos Botte and Hoffmann, tenors Hollande and Heitzinger, and bass baritone Breiting. By 1833, the theater director also began to put together what would become the Russian opera troupe, consisting of first-rate singers, Osip Petrov, Maria Stepanova, Anna Vorobyova, and Lev Leonov. These names are famous because they created the main roles in Glinka's Жизнь за царя in 1836. The state simultaneously worked to modernize and diversify theater offerings. What was fashionable in Paris, Vienna, and Berlin would now be heard within a year or two in St. Petersburg. Starting in 1834, the state made a big bet on contemporaneous French repertoire, which it followed immediately with major updates to the Italian. The first triumph of this repertorial transformation was Auber's La Mouette de Portici as Fenella, sung in German in January of 1834. While the German troupe performed Fenella to sold-out houses, the newly created Russian troupe mounted Erol Zampa, which it followed with Meyerbeer's Robert le Diable. In theater year 1835, Bellini's Norma and Rossini's Semiramide took St. Petersburg by storm. In 1836, opera broke all box office records. Bellini's I Capuletti Montecchi was so popular that it had to be given by both the Russian and the German troops. And the other big opera of the season turned out to be Glinka's Жизнь за царя, which was followed immediately by the premiere of Donizetti's Anna Bolena. The opera production, too, became increasingly more lavish. Stunning decorations, frequently imported directly from Europe, and astonishing state effects were all the rage. The state was quite literally transporting the operatic experience of major European capitals to the Bolshoi stage and inviting St. Petersburg audiences to partake in that transnational culture. It worked. Opera was gaining cultural prestige across all the classes of the kind it did not have in the previous decade, and possibly ever. By 1835, it was chic to attend opera. And here Nikolai led by example. Although he himself strongly disliked opera, he began to frequent it, bringing the audience with him. Nightly journals of the theater's directorate reveals that the royal family, the court, and the entire diplomatic corps were present at all the premieres for both Russian and German troops. Even without Tsar in attendance, aristocrats began to flock to opera in very large numbers. Moreover, many people now traveled to St. Petersburg specifically to hear opera. Opera tourism of sorts developed around the performances of the hits like La Mouette, Robert, and Жизнь за царя. In 1836, Nikolai Gogol wrote, "The hunger for opera is immense here. The enthusiasm with which St. Petersburg threw itself into the vivid music of Fenella, the wild, saturated with wild pleasure music of Robert, still persists. Semiramide, which audiences met with indifference 5 years ago, now brings the very same audiences to the heights of ecstasy, and one cannot overstate the enthusiasm generated by the opera Жизнь за царя." But did this opera craze change the audience makeup? The answer seems to be largely negative. While the number of audience members increased exponentially, the demographic did not change, and neither did audience behavior. Although audiences of different classes shared a common operatic experience, they appear to have not interacted much, and their respective theater etiquette differed as well. To be sure, certain behavioral expectations were common across all classes. For example, the slotted time for opera performances at the Bolshoi was between 7 and 11 in the evening. Unlike spoken plays or ballets, arriving late or leaving opera early was considered in poor taste. Audiences were expected to be in their seats by 7 and stay until the end. Those sitting at the parterre or occupying the boxes had to abide by specific dress codes. Formal attire was expected, but it could not be excessive, wrote one noblewoman to another. The dress should be habit de salon, meaning neither a house dress nor a ballroom gown, but something in between, as they say. The shoulders should be covered with tails, a scarf, or a kerchief. Young women do not wear diamonds. Earrings, buckles, and bracelets should be simple, that is, made out of gold or bronze, so long as they are of the latest fashion. Men either wore uniforms or evening dress, which required a vest and tailcoat. How those outside of these elites dressed, we do not know. During the performances of an opera, audiences remained seated and by and large silent, paying attention to the happenings of the stage. Talking and visiting with each other during the performance was considered rude and had to be reserved for intermission. In this, at least, St. Petersburg's opera etiquette differed mightily from that of theaters in Italy and even France. One reviewer compared the Italian operatic experience with that of St. Petersburg. Would the Italians who attend theater as if it were an assembly and come to their boxes only to hear their beloved arias believe that here we sit continuously for 5 hours without getting up? Theater audiences in St. Petersburg were also remarkably generous in their expressions of approbation. Such expressions were acceptable, but their specific manifestations varied by class. It was considered inappropriate for the nobility to applaud, though the practice was not prohibited. Instead, men would knock on the floor with their walking sticks, and women could tap with their fans. For this class, vocal expressions of delight was a categorical violation of decorum. For the lower classes, those occupying that uppermost tier of the theater, loud expression of approval was the norm. These audiences stomped their feet and freely offered their ovations, to say nothing of endless screams of bravo, which all too often interrupted the singing. No matter the type or quality of singing, the general response was always one of extreme approval by way of very loud applause. Time and again, in their written reviews, theater critics admonished the audiences to be more selective. One wrote in exasperation, "It is understandable and natural that a powerful aria, impassioned and bold, or a dazzling display of virtuosity delights the listener, carries them away, and compels them to express their pleasure loudly. But when the singing is delicate, simple, then loud, stormy applause most unpleasantly breaks the enchantment we were enjoying and reveals that the applauders themselves have no understanding of what they're attempting to praise. It would be prudent for them to restrain their impassioned outbursts and moderate the ovations, so that expressions of appreciation may be more meaningful and enduring." Much of the etiquette that I just sketched out applies to the audiences attending Russian and Italian opera troupes. It contrasted sharply with the experience of the German theater. Zotov reminisced about the German theater audiences in the 1830s. And what a patriarchal audience it was. The ladies would arrive in their loges dressed in the simplest household attire and would sit calmly, knitting their socks, occasionally using them to dry a tear during the more touching moments. Calling the artists to the stage was uncommon, and applause was rare. But from the sound of the noses being blown, whether from tears or laughter during the comic scenes, the actors knew their performance had brought pleasure. Another contemporary reminisced, "Male and female spectators come to the German theater not in festive attire, but dressed as if they're attending family evening. Very few boxes do not have children in them. In the parterre, showing off are the young clerks, artists, and the like. They enter boldly, with extreme knocking and shuffling, regardless of whether the show is in progress. Yet all of these viewers savor the performance fully. They gather not to criticize, but to enjoy themselves. They cry and laugh with wholehearted enthusiasm. In short, the German-speaking audiences, primarily composed of the city's civil servants, tradesmen, and craftsmen, had their own theater etiquette. During the 1830s, opera in St. Petersburg evolved from a culturally marginal institution to the dominant and most profitable form of theater. It became a viable public genre, a form of mass entertainment embraced by a broad audience. Opera attendance surged dramatically over the course of the decade. Still, the social makeup of each troupe's audience, as well as their respective theater behaviors, remained largely unchanged. The opera boom that created this mass audience reached the point of diminishing returns by 1840, when the trends that I trace today began to reverse. The aristocratic audience returned full time to the French theater, abandoning both Russian and German companies. The German audience dried up. The Russian troupe fared better, but was soon eclipsed in popularity by the ballet troupe. The complex story of this reversal is yet to be told. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was wonderful. We have some time for questions. Do I have any on Zoom
Just a curiosity, if
or
I
in
may.
the room? Sure, yes.
May I? Thank you, Daniel. It was, as always, very interesting. And I would like to go back to one of your earliest slides.
Give me a second to pull it up. Hold on.
The quote, but the probably it was the very first quote about
The very quote about
theater being yes, that's the quote, which about the several troops that daily offer various entertainments to all classes of the society. Okay, I don't know who is the author, but and
I
of
don't know
course,
either.
okay, because they are not always signed, and just a curiosity, but of course, when we deal with all classes of society, we are excluding a majority of population.
Yes, over 90% of population. Go on.
Okay, so okay, because this is misunderstanding that you probably already know, but okay, this society is the one you described. So from bourgeoisie up to higher levels.
That is correct.
Okay, and do you have any? Did you come across any witnesses of considering other layers of population being at least considered in this public press? Or
Yeah, I think, as you correctly say, the vast majority of the Russian population has no access to the theater. Theater is expensive, and opera theater in particular is very expensive. As you know, what I just showed, a ruble is a lot of money. Very few people can afford to go. So most of the lower social classes, that is below the petit bourgeoisie, really do not attend opera. We begin to see a change of that in the 1850s when suddenly bakers in St. Petersburg start to go to the theater. But it doesn't really happen in the 1830s. At least I have not been able to locate any records of it. But of course, part of the problem is that this is the social class which is not documented in any of these reviews.
yes, and it's not even in the horizon of those
No,
writers who are documented, who left witnesses. So
exactly.
this, okay, so I think you are, no, this is important because as we know, when we talk about Russian theater and the beginning of Russian opera, of course, very often we came across declaration of something like national opera, opera of the people, and so on and so forth, which you already know, of course, and that's so.
Yeah, I think we should all start with a disclaimer that opera is the elitist form of entertainment in Russia at this time, and that it's not accessible to most Russian people.
Yeah, so nothing really comprehensive and and nothing that really regards the country in a way.
That is correct.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. When will the book come out?
Good question. I don't have an answer to that one.
Okay, we've got one more question from the floor here, and then we'll move on. Here's Keaton.
Thank you very much for another interesting paper on the operatic culture, Daniil.
Thanks, Keaton.
I was wondering if you could please explain why the state undertook their revision of the theaters in the mid-1830s, as you explained.
Yeah, this was a long-range project, and it started in 1826. I think part of the challenge was that during the final 5 to 6 years of Alexander's reign, so roughly from 1820 to 1825, the state of Russia's operatic theater really collapsed. I mean, it went down big time in every possible way, between the quality of theaters themselves as in renovations. There was total lack of renovations, terrible deficits, and so forth. And lack of updated repertoire. When Nikolai became Tsar, he really started this project of trying to rebuild the culture, which in essence now resembled more what his grandmother had, Catherine, in the 1780s and 1790s. And I think that's what really drove him to do that. It was a gradual process. The first step was the bringing of the Italian troupe. And when that didn't work out, the state started a much more aggressive approach. And this kind of operatic transformation, this is what I call the operatic surge, was the result of this really aggressive way of trying to elevate St. Petersburg to the level of other European capitals.
Wanted their city to be rich in culture. That was the state's motivation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Daniil. Another round of applause, please.
Thank you.